Just want to make sure you all got your drinks and refreshments. If you feel the need to go out and get something, if you're a little peckish, help yourself. For those of you who don't know, my name is Lynn Bardwell. I'm Senior Advisor on Native Affairs here at Grand Valley State University, as well as the Assistant Director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs, where we do all of the programming centering our Indigenous students. And I want to introduce as well Levi Rickert. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Levi. Born and raised in Grand Rapids, how's that? Proud citizen of the Prairie Bay Potawatomi Nation. We just got back, it was 150 acres state park down in Illinois over last Friday. And yeah. And I am publisher, editor of Native News Online and Tribal Business News. I am also on the Native American Advisory Council here at Grand Valley. I've been on here since its inception. We haven't quite figured out what year that was, but it's been a good 20 years. And we have constantly worked very hard to increase programs for Native Americans. And we're happy you are out tonight. It's actually a privilege. Now, during the time Bryan Newland was the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, I was always very cautious publicly to call him Assistant Secretary Newland. Now I can call him Bryan tonight. So, but he is a homegrown Michigan guy who grew up in Burley, Michigan, and Bay Mills Indian community over the bridge, and he actually went to law school at Michigan State, ended up working for the Obama administration. Then he went back to Bay Mills and he was a tribal judge. He became tribal chairperson, and he actually was the leader of the tribe during the COVID-19 pandemic. So soon thereafter, President Biden and Secretary Howland tapped him to be the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. It's a very, very important job in Washington, D.C. He had a lot of interaction with Secretary Howland. We're going to talk about all this tonight, and it's really our pleasure to bring him here to Grand Rapids, and thank you for coming, Bryan. Welcome to Grand Valley State University, and Lynn, tell the people who are non-native whose land they're on right now.
Oh, yes. So we are currently residing on the lands of the Anishinaabe people, the home of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Odawa. And we have a land acknowledgement that we have created in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. It was our staff that created that. And it follows our mission, vision, and values for OMA, and follows what we are capable of within our department. And so we created a action plan in terms of a land acknowledgement, stating that due to the boarding school, we realized that higher ed has its issues with Native folks entering in, and we are going to reduce as many of those barriers as possible for our Native students to allow for a higher level of student success. And so it has been through the efforts of the Native American Advisory Council that got us to the point where we're able to get funding and to provide support for our Native students. So I want to thank Grand Valley and NAC for that work. Did you want to introduce yourself real quick? I mean, everyone knows who you are. I just didn't know if you wanted to say something about yourself outside of your hair regime.
Hair regime? No.
Yeah.
Honey, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate you all sharing some of your time with me and with us for this conversation, and folks who are joining us online. Miigwech, thank you for joining there as well. My name is Bryan Newland. I'm a proud Bay Millionaire, Bay Mills Indian Community tribal member from way up north, where I've been living most of my life, except when I wasn't in law school and a couple of stints in Washington, D.C. So I actually came down this morning. I left and it was still winter. So it's nice to get here where it's almost not winter. But I'm really glad to be here tonight and really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thanks for being here again for the second time. We had you in, I think, last year. You were still a federal official, and so some of the questions we had asked, you had to answer in a very federal way. So we're really excited.
We recall he had his special handcuffs on.
Yeah. So one of the positive things of the last election was the fact that now you are able to join us and be able to speak as Bryan Newland. So we're excited. So to bring it back to the Obama administration, your COVID-19 handling with your tribe, and then to be later appointed Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, what lessons did you learn as a tribal leader through that COVID pandemic and other things that helped you as a role as Assistant Secretary?
Well, a couple of things, but first I just want to maybe share a little bit about how I ended up at the Department of the Interior the first time and then the second time, because I was not somebody, I've always been interested in government and politics, but I didn't know a lot of people outside Bay Mills when I was growing up, and I didn't know a lot of people outside Michigan. And I graduated from MSU, go green.
Go white.
I graduated from MSU back in 2003, and I'm married to my high school sweetheart. We grew up, less than 500 yards from each other. And so she went to MSU as well. And I thought I wanted to go to law school, made some plans, but I was going to leave the state. And found out not long after I graduated college that we were going to be parents. And was thinking, oh man, how am I going to make this law school thing work? And I got a call one day from this guy saying, hey, I heard you're interested in law school. I'm starting an Indian law program at Michigan State University. Let's have some lunch. And MSU offered me a scholarship to be the first student in the Indian law program at MSU. And that allowed me to make law school work. And that professor ended up going on to be appointed by President Obama to work at the Department of the Interior. And a few years later, he called me and he said, hey, how do you feel about quitting your job at your big law firm in Lansing, where I was working, taking a big pay cut and moving your family across the country to do a really intense job? And I said, yeah, that sounds awesome. And
it was the pay cut that did it, right?
It was the pay cut. And so my family, we did that. We bet on ourselves. I bet on myself. Believed in what President Obama was doing, and went to work for the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, who at the time was Larry Echohawk at the Department of the Interior. And I moved to D.C. It was October 12th, 2009, so it was my 28th birthday. I moved to D.C. and that's how I got my start at the Department of the Interior, and I worked there for the entire first term of President Obama's administration. And it was a wild ride. It was a lot of fun, and I didn't really know much about anything at 28 years old. I thought I did. I thought I knew a lot about how the government should operate. So once you kind of worm your way into the system, you go on these lists, right? Like, who wants to come be the assistant secretary? Well, call Bryan. He's been here before. He might know how to do it. And so that's how I, that's one of the ways that, the door was open for me. But after that, after my first time at the department, I moved home to Bay Mills and got elected as tribal court judge because I wanted to use my education and my skills to serve in my community, and then got elected as chairman in 2017. And I learned a lot about how things really work in tribal government. One of the things we were talking about before we got started here was when you are a tribal official, there's no escape. There's no escaping the people you're serving. So you know pretty quickly whether what you're doing is working or whether it's not. And your own community members are going to hold you accountable, good or bad. And you also know that what it takes to get money from the federal government into tribal government, and then how to spend that in your community and make it work for your own people. And so that's one of the things that I really took with me when I went back to DC as assistant secretary is, how is what we're doing, how's it going to translate on the ground, on the res for tribal governments? And always trying to keep in the front of my mind and our minds, what does this mean on the ground in Indian country? Because something can sound really good in DC, and on the res, on the ground, it can end up like a disaster, or it can end up being completely meaningless. And so I tried to take those lessons. Another lesson I tried to take was my experience as chairman during COVID back in 2020. It felt like a lot of times, I know a lot of us collectively have blocked out the first 5 or 6 months of COVID, but it felt like we were abandoned. It felt like we were on our own in our community, without a lot of resources, without a lot of help, without any expertise about the virus and the disease and how it could spread. It was very much a situation where our tribal leadership, we all realized there's nobody coming to save us. And so we also, when I went to DC to work in President Biden's administration, wanted to make sure that we were not putting tribes in that position. That, we're not going to come save anybody, because the federal government isn't going to save anybody, but we had to be there to help. And I knew what it was like to be a tribal leader and feel abandoned by the trustee, and I wanted to make sure that we were not putting tribes in that position.
And I understand that your tribe actually got through it fairly well, in comparison to some other tribes.
Yeah.
Navajo Nation was devastated by it.
We worked really hard, and a lot of tribes did, and I felt like here in Michigan, our 12 federally recognized tribes worked really closely together to share data. But we were doing things like surveillance testing for COVID before. In fact, the HHS at the time was saying, don't use your COVID tests on people unless you think they have COVID, which sounded really stupid to us. So we said, well, we've got to figure out how prevalent it is. And so we were coordinating with Sault Ste. Marie tribe and local health officials to do surveillance testing, and then other public health agencies started copying from us in the work we were doing. And we really tried to borrow from what was working around the world. And one of the things that we saw was, whether it was in New Zealand or Japan or other places, where they were daily updates in telling people, hey, as your elected officials, there's a lot we don't know, and being honest with people about that, because that builds trust. So when you ask people things or you tell people things, they believe you because you're being honest when you say, I don't know, or we don't have an answer to that. And so we were always, I say we because it was our tribal leadership and our leadership team, we were always trying to communicate and build buy-in for this community effort to sacrifice for our community's well-being. And we ended up having a disproportionately low transmission rate in our community. And I don't like saying only, because I don't want to minimize people dying in our community, but we had, in that whole time, all of COVID, we had one person pass. And that person passed after he had been vaccinated. He had gotten his first dose. Remember the first vaccines? He had gotten his first dose and thought he could, there was a small holiday gathering, and some folks came out of that gathering. I don't want to put the blame on him because it wasn't his fault. But we kept people safe, we saved lives by working together and by really taking it upon ourselves to protect ourselves and not put our faith in anyone outside of Bay Mills to do it for us.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, I like the idea you had that knowledge you could take to Washington with you when you became the assistant secretary. Now, you became assistant secretary in a very special time in American Indian history. You can say it that way. And we like to refer to it as a moment. Secretary Deb Holland, we got to serve under her, and some of the folk, there she is right there. The first Native American to ever serve in secretarial role in the presidential cabinet. It took all these years and she became that. You worked with her. And just for the audience who knows, I run Native News Online, and we're going to talk about it in a few minutes, but Native News Online went to every single Road to Healing tour, and they went to 12 around the country. So I got to witness firsthand the interaction between Deb Holland and Bryan Newland. It was quite a treat. And the intensity on the face, and tell us about working with Deb Holland. What a treat that must have been.
Yeah, she's awesome. She's hilarious too, which is really nice to bring that that Indian humor to those jobs where you take your work seriously but not yourself. She used to tease me sometimes, but in a loving way. Is many of you know is if people aren't teasing you, if your family isn't teasing you, your friends aren't teasing you, they probably don't like you. This time you're like, if I'm teasing you, it means I love you. So she was always good for that, and very thoughtful and very caring. And so Secretary Holland loves to cook, and we'd always have these staff lunches and potlucks, and I'd be there. I'd be like, I'm the assistant secretary. I'm too busy. I can't cook for this. I got to swing by the grocery store on the way to work and pick up a fruit tray or something. And then I get there, and then she had baked a cake, or she had prepared this big dish of something homemade, or made a big pot of green chili stew. And I'm like, I'm sitting here whining about I'm too busy to cook for the employee thing. And she's a cabinet secretary, training for marathons, completing her education, running one of the largest cabinet agencies in the United States government, being a historic figure, and then also just, baking for people and cooking for people.
And I understand after the Road to Healing up in Pellston, she went up to Bay Mills and did some cooking at your place.
Yep, she did. So these events, the boarding school listening sessions we did, were really intense. And really difficult for everybody, the people who came to share their stories, of course, but also our team. And so we always tried to make sure that we were taking time after those to care for ourselves. And so at Little Travers up in Pellston, we had one of the first sessions, and it was summertime, and summertime up north, well, you guys know, it's awesome. And so I invited my wife and I, we still lived there while I was serving in D.C. for most of the time. We kept our house there, and we said, hey, after this event, we'll host, and we'll fry up some whitefish and do wild rice, and have a team dinner at our place up in Bay Mills. And again, Secretary Holland loves to cook, so she had broken her foot a couple of weeks before, and she was in a walking boot, and got there, and she was insisting on helping, and we said, no, just go sit out by the lake and relax with the team. We got this. And my wife and I were in the kitchen frying up whitefish, and then I looked over, and Secretary Holland was kind of standing in the doorway and looking, and then we were cooking, and then she was sitting in the kitchen with us asking questions, and then she was saying, show me how to do this? And so then, she was battering the fish, and by the end, she was standing over the stove frying the fish herself, because she loves to cook. She couldn't help herself, and she said she was chilly, so we had Secretary Holland in our kitchen in a big flannel frying whitefish like a true Bay millionaire. That was pretty fun. But she is really genuine, and she is thoughtful. She remembers people's names. She asks about their family. She does handwritten notes and shares gifts. She's always buying jewelry and gifts for people, and just incredibly thoughtful, and 100 times more warm and thoughtful behind the scenes as the public got to see her.
She's running for governor of New Mexico now, and she raised $2 million within like 5 weeks for her campaign. So I interviewed her last week, and she's a treat.
She's awesome.
Back to you, Glenn.
Well, just a quick follow-up with that, so we did have a moment for Native people having the first Native secretary. What do you think was the benefit of having not only one, but like 2 Native folks running some of these things?
There's so many ways I could describe how it made a difference. First, I want to share just a story too. So when I was sworn in as assistant secretary in August of 21, and flew down to DC because I was working remotely for the first 9 months of my job. My office was in the corner of my bedroom up in Bay Mills, and so I flew down to DC to get sworn in. We had to do it with masks on. And we stepped out on the secretary's balcony in her office. The Secretary of the Interior's office is one of the best offices in the whole federal government, probably after the president. And she has a balcony that overlooks the mall in Washington, D.C. there. It was really just a beautiful sunny day. And she and I and her chief of staff, Larry Roberts, who also was the acting assistant secretary in the Obama administration, and the 3 of us were just hanging out there for 15 minutes after the fact. And then Larry and I were leaving, walking down the hall, and he said, "Hey Bryan, the last time a Native cabinet secretary, Native chief of staff, and a Native assistant secretary were standing out on the secretary's balcony hanging out?" And I looked at him kind of funny. He's like, "Never. It's never happened until just now."
Did you take a picture?
Yeah, I've got some pictures. But it was, there were so many moments like that that was really surreal. And I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, so I'm always using Lord of the Rings for analogies. But there's a scene in Lord of the Rings, the first one, where Frodo and Sam are on their journey. And then Sam stops and he says, "If I take one more step, it will be the furthest from the Shire I've ever been." And I used to use that saying with Secretary Holland because every day that we were there together, every day that she was there, and all these other Natives in these high-ranking positions, that was the furthest from our past we had ever been in terms of the department's treatment of Indian people. And so got to be a part of just every day was a historic moment. And, I had a job to do, we had jobs to do, but I always tried to stop, every day and just kind of soak that in because of how unique that was. And so when we, got there in 2021, we had a big agenda, and many of you will remember up in Canada, there was the discovery or rediscovery of the mass grave at the Kamloops boarding school, and there was a worldwide outcry and a reckoning in Canada, but in the United States, Indian people were saying, well, we've got our own history with these residential boarding schools, and we've got to do something. So you ask, what difference did it make having Secretary Holland there? I'd been at the department in the Obama administration, and when you would want to do something, especially something big, you got to research the heck out of it. You got to do briefing memos and briefings, and then go back and redo your memos to answer questions that were asked, and then go through another briefings, and just to get people comfortable with the idea of doing something. And so, that was at the end of April that happened in 2021. And we took that to Secretary Holland and had a discussion about, we've got to do something here. And she wanted to do something. And so we kind of laid out just some steps to start to do something. And we didn't have to put together hundreds of pages of briefing memos and had meeting after meeting. Her response was simple. It was, of course. Because she didn't have to be educated about what these boarding schools were. Her family had lived through it. She didn't have to be educated on the policies of it, the implications for Indian people today. She didn't need none of that. And her response was, of course. So we went from the last week of April, and I think it was the second week of June, she was at the National Congress of American Indians announcing the United States government's first ever initiative to investigate these boarding schools. Less than 8 weeks from, that wasn't on our agenda when we walked in the door. And she saw the moment and the urgency and the moral imperative to take on that work. And in less than 8 weeks started that project. The federal government doesn't order pens in 8 weeks. Right? And through her leadership took on this initiative. Because she was able to do that with that speed. We were able to do that with that speed because she did. And if we didn't have a Native person in the chair, if we did not have Deb Holland in that office, that doesn't happen.
I think that's so interesting because some of us who are out here, whether you're at a university setting, corporate setting, sometimes you are the only Native person in the room. And you have to explain. So when we say there's a moment, it really was truly a moment. And I applaud what you and Deb Holland did with the Indian boarding schools. But I think there's a lesson in that for people.
Can I interject there?
Most certainly.
So
we're having a conversation.
Yeah. There's a writer who I really like. Many of you may have heard of him, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's incredible, does great work. And at the end of the Obama presidency, he wrote a piece in the Atlantic. I can't remember the exact title now, so I don't want to get it wrong, but basically about the moment, that 8 years being a moment for Black Americans to have President Obama and Michelle Obama in the White House. And in that piece he wrote in the Atlantic, you can look it up, he's writing about going to a White House holiday party and just looking around and seeing a sea of Black faces at the White House, and just what it meant for him and how he never took that for granted in that moment. And I want to say it was 2022 in November, Native Heritage Month. President Biden and the First Lady, Dr. Biden, hosted a Native Heritage Month celebration at the White House, just for Native muckety-mucks and Native celebrities, and just, I got to take my daughter to that party, and just walking around the White House full of a bunch of Indians. I thought of that article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and then I was just my mouth was agape the whole evening, couldn't believe it.
This is happening.
Standing in the White House in Washington, D.C., at a res party. It was fancy. But,
Can I
just...
ask you a question?
Sure.
Did the press cover it like they did the other one?
I don't think so.
No.
That's
And actually, I was supposed to be there. However,
Oh, he's the media.
I'm media. But I was interviewing Billy Mills at Grand Valley State University.
Oh.
We looked at each other and said, we're supposed to be at the White House. But here we are at Grand Valley, so I guess we are committed to Grand Valley.
Yeah.
But no, I had the same feeling, Brian, when we were up in Secretary Holland's office at the conclusion of the White House Tribal Summit last year. And I was looking over. And for the Native Americans, I grew up here in Grand Rapids. And until you get out and really mingle with other Native people. I remember the first National Congress of American Indians I ever went to. I looked around, it's like 3,000 Indians in this room. And I thought, I had not had that experience. Because grew up in Grand Rapids and knew the community here. But when you get out and you see
Like me.
blonde, blue-eyed Indians, you see black Indians, you see plains-looking Indians, and you know what I'm talking about. But it's quite an experience. But I think someone was actually said, will we ever be invited back to the secretary's office again as we were in December last year? So we had that moment too. So,
Yeah, it was pretty awesome, and again, this is a sign of, like, you know, there are moments in your life when you realize you're getting old. But as you know, the first time I was in DC, I was like with a bunch of other young guys with long hair, and people like all these young bucks with their ponytails, doing their hot shit, you know, strutting around. They go back to DC, and then they're like, I felt like that old uncle, you know, because all of a sudden I'm older than everybody. But at these moments, you know, with our staff, our team, most of whom were much younger than me, or at least looked much younger than me, you know, telling them, reinforcing them in those moments, like, this is not normal. This is not only is this not normal for just like everyday American people, but it's also not normal for Indian people, and it's not normal historically. Like, don't ever take it for granted.
Right.
But Bryan, I want to ask you a question, because this has really bothered me last year during the election. And I've talked to Native people, and there was one woman, she said to me, the Biden administration has done one thing for Native Americans. And I looked at her, pointed, and I said, you have not been paying attention. Because I can honestly say, you can go in and document, the Biden administration was the best presidential administration for Native Americans in history. And we had good ones like Obama, Nixon, but Biden surpassed them all. And even on his last day of office, what did he do? He released Leonard Peltier.
Leonard Peltier, yeah.
And grassroots people wanted that. Tribal leaders didn't think it would ever happen. I talked to many tribal leaders. I didn't even think it was going to happen. I was on an airplane when I got notice it was happening. I said, oh my God. I literally started crying. Because the idea that a president thought so highly, then not even counting his wife, Joe Biden came to, was it 10 different?
Yeah, I lost count. It was a lot.
Indian reservations. No first lady had ever, Michelle Obama went one time to Standing Rock with President Obama. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt got lost on Osage in Oklahoma in the late 30s, I think it was. First time a first lady went to a reservation. But the point is, what do you tell Native people who feel like they don't really pay attention, and what should they be, what can we do to make people really aware of what's going
Well,
on?
not only that,
Well,
but if you listen to Canadians, we've been dead for hundreds of years.
I think Levi, it's not the job of Indian people to give federal officials a pat on the back.
No.
And I don't think it's right for us to ask that of Indian people. And so anger and skepticism and frustration has been built up for centuries, and it's well earned. I will say, you know, elections have consequences, actions have consequences. You know, in our political system in the United States, we're not a parliament. We're a Republican democracy, and we get two choices on the ballot in the fall. And so, you know, I understand, you know, a lot of Indian people might say, there's still a lot of bad things happening in Indian country, and yeah, I see these press releases come out, but, you know, I haven't seen a big shift in my daily life. I understand where that comes from. You know, it's not their job to cut through the noise. It's our job to make sure we're telling the story and educating. But you know, I do think Indian people I don't think Indian people should opt out of the electoral system, the electoral process, because you know, we see what happens. And we've seen what happens for many, many years. And also, as you know, Bryan Newland, a lot of Indian people sacrificed a lot to make sure that we have our right to vote too in these elections.
Well, beyond the progress made in Indian country during your Biden administration, we wanted to explore how Indian policy can continue to evolve and strengthen in the years ahead. So the early weeks of the second Trump administration has caused concern, to say the least, in Indian country, with tribes struggling to access federal funding, layoffs, including tribal colleges, our health. What is your reaction to these developments, and what concerns you most about the next 4 years?
Well, a couple of days after the election, I was talking on the phone with a good friend of mine. I was pretty bummed out, obviously, and we were talking about what comes next, over the next 4 years. He said, Bryan, he said, we've already had like 20 Donald Trumps as Indian people. We've already had, dozens of presidents who were trying to take things, and Andrew Jackson and others trying to wipe out our ancestors completely, commit true genocide. And so Indian people have been through it, and we're still here. And we were talking before the show. How many of you guys have heard of Vine Deloria? Yeah. So Vine Deloria, he wrote a lot of awesome stuff, said a lot of awesome stuff. He wrote an essay in the New York Times in the early 1970s. The essay was titled, "This Country Was a Lot Better Off When Indians Were Running It." But in that essay...
Say it again.
But in that essay, he's talking about, he was describing, he was the executive director for the National Congress for American Indians, and he was talking about being in Washington, D.C., and he's getting it incoming from all over Indian country, solve this problem, solve that problem. And then, he was talking about the demands of trying to run around to conferences and come up with policies and initiatives and stuff. And in that essay, then he writes, "But back on the res, life went on." And so you ask about the next 4 years. I think back to when I was in tribal leadership during the first Trump administration. Nobody's coming to save us. So, and life's going to go on the res. Our ancestors outlasted and outwitted and outlived the survivor motto. Presidents trying to do much worse. It's our job to save ourselves, to build up these institutions in our communities, to take care of ourselves. So, I'm under no illusion that we're not in store for some pretty tough times, at least when it comes to our relationship with the federal government. But we've always, when I say we, I mean Indian people, and I include our ancestors, we've always, had, life has gone on, and we've always had the tools to take care of ourselves and take care of one another. And one of the things I think that's important too is, we've got to do that serious and important work of building up our institutions in our own communities, but we've got to do it in the Indian way, and it's okay to laugh while we're doing this. It's okay to cry when we're doing this. It's okay to take a day off and have fun. Because we're human beings, and we've got to make sure life goes on and our way of life goes on.
Perfect segue into the next question is so for our tribal leaders here and far online, what would your advice be for those tribal nations, and what should they be prioritizing in their communities?
Now I sound like an old head. Way back when I was, but I'm just drawing on lessons when I was serving in tribal leadership. Way back when in 2017, Donald Trump was the president. We had a Republican Congress. We had a Republican governor here in Michigan. Our tribal council when Bay Mills, our tribal council is all elected, all seats are up every 2 years, so we were all mostly new. We got together and we made a very conscious decision together that we were going to limit our engagement with the federal government. Because we just said we were not confident we were going to have success on the things that were important to us with the Trump administration. And so we said, we made the conscious decision to limit our interaction with the federal government. And instead, we poured a lot of time into strategic development, long-term. Our local relationships, townships, counties, local health agencies, and with the state of Michigan. And so during that time, we worked with Governor Snyder and a Republican legislature to help invest state funds to build a new state-of-the-art health center on our reservation. That is now it's one of the leading healthcare providers in the Eastern Upper Peninsula. It's one of our largest employers. It attracts educated tribal members back. We did that through partnership with the state.
And is it Bay Mills Community College growing their nursing program?
Yep. And so we also worked with the state of Michigan in the legislature and other tribes in Michigan to pass the online gaming bill that has grown, at least for Bay Mills, our gaming revenues, and that money got invested back in our community. We put a lot of work into our relationships with our state legislators and local officials that paid dividends during COVID. And we saw success there with both parties at the local level. And that was a deliberate strategy to not go to DC, because we just felt like we weren't going to have success there. If anything, we were going to attract negative attention. So to answer your question, that was a really long-winded uncle way of getting to the answer of your
You're
question.
a yapper.
I'm the yapper.
You heard it, yeah.
Yeah. I think tribes should be very strategic about where they want to engage the federal government these days, and put a lot of time, and those that are already doing this redouble efforts to build our own governing institutions at home, because nobody else is going to do it for us. So we've got to do it for ourselves. And this is as good a time as any to focus on the home front.
Nice.
That's a headline.
Did you write that down?
I did. I did. Bryan, and say we do pause, so to speak, with the federal government, get real strategic. What should tribes be doing with treaties, and why are they so important? That confuses a lot of non-natives sometimes when we talk treaties. What should we do in treaties now during the Trump 2.0?
Well, so I used to teach Indian law as an adjunct law professor, so I'm going to get my Indian law professor hat on for a second. We talk about, in the United States, we all learn in civics class in high school about federalism and the Constitution. States gave some of their powers to create the federal government, and that's the charter between states and the federal government. Well, treaties do the same thing between tribes and the federal government. And the federal government of the United States received the benefit of these treaties, and tribes retained the rights they didn't give up, and sometimes in the treaties made it explicit. We're giving you this land, but we can still hunt on it. Or we're giving you this land, but you're going to give us money for a doctor or money for a school. And I think a couple of things when it comes to treaties. One is we always have to educate people that treaty rights aren't just for Indians. The United States has a treaty right to the land that was taken or ceded through that treaty. And so if you're going to receive the benefit of that, you also got to pay the price for that. Two is I think we've always got to be educating ourselves on the scope of our rights under our treaties and be uncompromising when it comes to defending that. That is an area at Bay Mills where we said we will not have a choice to avoid engagement with the federal government on our treaty fishing rights. that was something that we have to always make sure that we're upholding that. That's our responsibility. So I think tribes should be uncompromising in asserting their treaty rights. That doesn't mean reckless. You have to be thoughtful and strategic, and always educating our local communities, our neighbors, about treaty rights. They're not just my rights as a Bay Mills tribal member. They're your rights, Mayor of Sault Ste. Marie. They're your rights, Governor of Michigan. The Treaty of 1836 is what allowed the state of Michigan to become a state in 1837. And so we've got to be educating, we've got to be asserting, and we've got to be uncompromising.
Yeah, and I think that you should take note that I did a little research recently that about 82% of all treaties contain the word educate our youth. For those terms, it's education, and in these times when the federal government, the president through his executive order last week wants to dismantle the Department of Ed, they have a responsibility to educate Native students. And I think that you in the audience, you need to be aware of that, tribal leaders, hold them to it. So.
Well, on that too, Levi, I made a vow to myself years ago to not argue with people on social media, so I don't do it. But I saw somebody I know had.
That's good advice. You're not engaged with social media.
I saw somebody I know who had shared a post on her social media. She had shared a post on her social media about the Department of Education, saying this was a Native person saying, don't worry, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has the trust responsibility for us. And I almost broke my vow to not argue with people on social media, because the trust responsibility to Indian people doesn't just belong to the BI, it's the whole United States government. Every agency, Congress, and the judicial branch. And so, there are a lot of reasons why it would be bad to close the Department of Education. I think a lot of people don't really understand what the Department of Education does. But if we go that route, the United States has that trust obligation to ensure that our young people are getting an education.
I agree.
I have a lot of questions about that question. But so when we talk about treaties, and we talk about in today's administration cutting down and eliminating DEI work, right? Diversity, inclusion, and equity work. What would your answer be if I asked you, are we a political entity or are we a race or ethnicity?
My answer is yes.
We're all of it.
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Yes. I sometimes hear well-meaning Indian people try to say, "Oh, we're not a race, or we're not an ethnicity, or a political classification." And our political classification is based on our cultural identity, and that's we could talk about that. One of the reasons why it's important to maintain cultural autonomy as Native people. But we have distinct cultures and ethnicities and a race, but we also have sovereign governments, and we also have a trust relationship with the United States, not just from tribes. Every Indian person is owed the trust responsibility by the federal government. So you can you can issue policies that get rid of land acknowledgements and get rid of Navajo code talkers on the Department of Defense website and things like that. That doesn't take away that trust responsibility. That's a legal responsibility. And the government, whether you want to call me a DEI hire as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, the government owes that trust responsibility to me and to you and to all tribes and all Indian people. And I don't care what acronym you want to put on it, that's not going away.
Leave
Well,
I'm still thinking about that answer.
honestly, we could be here all night because Native News Online's readership has doubled the last 6 to 8 weeks since the Trump administration. People are coming to us wanting answers. And we don't always have the answers because talk to people in federal government, they don't even respond. They get a little better, but they give non-answers. But because I don't think they even know. Some of the rank and file people in federal government are afraid they're going to lose their jobs, so they're not really saying a whole lot. So I guess, Bryan, navigating through all this, what advice would you give to the common person, people in our audience, people listening online? What should Native people be doing right now? Should they be writing their congressmen, senators, writing to the local press, letters to the editor? What should they be doing?
How many of you guys remember your high school civics? How many people here had civics in high school? Right. So, in our politics, because we treat culturally, our culture, not Indian culture, American culture, we treat politics as kind of like a spectator sport sometimes, and it's team red and team blue, and Donald Trump. It's all about the president. If we were in a parliamentary system, right, that would make some sense. But you guys remember from civics, we've got 3 branches of government. The president is just one branch. It's not even, by the way, the president, the executive branch isn't even the most important branch. That's why they put it in the 2nd article of the Constitution. We've got a Congress. And by always talking about the president, you're letting Article 1, the branch that represents the people, you're letting them off the hook. And so if you're always posting about Trump and talking about Trump and the president this and the president that, your senators and your Congress people are happy to just sit there and go unchallenged for re-election and let all the attention be on the Article 2 people. Because, well, that's good. People forget about that branch of our government. And they treat them as though like Congress works for the president. This is not a parliament.
No, they work for us.
Right.
Our tax money.
They do work for us. So my advice to Indian people and to all Americans is don't let your Congress people off the hook.
No.
They want to close Social Security offices? Ask your Congress people if they support it. They want to cut funding for Indian Health Service and Veterans Affairs?
Yeah.
Ask them if they support that and if they're going to vote for those budget cuts. Because one of the one of these things is that has happened recently. We all watched with the budget, mess in D.C. is that they passed a continuing resolution, which isn't a budget bill, and I won't bore you with the difference between those. But that continuing resolution gives the Congress giving a lot of its own power to the executive branch to make cuts. Because they don't want to be on the hook for making those decisions, voting for these cuts. So I can get really fired up about this and keep talking, but that's the branch of government that matters the most. That's why they wrote it into the 1st chapter, the 1st article of the Constitution. Don't let them off the hook.
Well, I think, Lynn, why don't you ask one more question, then we'll go to questions and answers.
Just to round up the conversation of getting activated, right? Like, how do we engage, and what should we be doing collectively as a group to engage with not only the Congress and the House and the Senate, but like our local officials, right? Like, how should we get involved in that work?
I think, again, the governments that matter the most in your life are the governments that are closest to you. Your school board, your township board, your city council, your county commission, your state legislators. Focus there. Those are the places that are gonna determine the curriculum at your school. They're gonna determine your property taxes. They're gonna determine what the speed limit is in your neighborhood. They're gonna determine all these things that you care about in your daily life. And if we're astute and forceful and don't go to sleep. We'll have a chance next year to have our say with what goes on in Washington, D.C., but that's not the only place that government's done. And we're going to have a governor's race here in Michigan. We're going to have legislative races. There's even off-year elections this year. That's where we got to be organizing. And in our communities, go to your tribal council meetings. Sorry. Ask your tribal council members. Ask your tribal chairs questions. If you have strong views, I'm talking to people who are watching online about what's going on in your tribal community, run for office of your tribe. You can run for tribal court maybe, or your tribal council, or your tribe might have different boards. A lot of times you have to beg people to run for these. You can run for these seats and make a big difference.
Can I ask-
Organize in your communities and try to move the government that affects you the most.
Well, just in LTBB land, we have our largest election for the open seats we have. I think we have 29 folks running for five of the open seats. So that is a huge push in us getting activated at the local level, which hopefully they'll become more activated, engaged with the state legislation. But that is a huge indicator that we are becoming activated.
I'm always amazed that sometimes these tribal elections, 201 votes will get you on that council.
I mean, elections have been won or lost by a vote.
Correct.
Yeah.
True story. My dad, my sister's here. Our dad ran for the school board when we were kids and had a tied vote, and they didn't have a runoff. They had to solve it by a coin flip, and he lost. He got back.
His best friend didn't vote.
Yeah, his best friend didn't vote.
That's how important it is to get out to the election. But we have the ability for the crowd to ask questions. Does anyone have
Hey,
questions?
before we do that, I do want to point out the photos that are circulating back here. It really that's Bryan at and that right there is the totem pole that went up in Anchorage. He actually helped lift it. And at that point, it was the only place in the United States that had a public memorial for Indian boarding schools. I would contend every city in this country should have a memorial for Indian boarding schools. Now, our museum director is here tonight. I'm going to talk to him about that. But I'm serious. It is. And I, like I say, we went to 12 of the 12 boarding schools, Road to Healing. I want to say it was one of the last 5 years, one of the most important things I think I attended. I attend a lot of Native American events. I saw my good friend Bryan Newland helping to hoist that totem pole up. Deb Holland, I don't have any pictures of her, but there he is looking up. It was cold, trust me, it was cold. It was October, wasn't it? Yeah. I'm glad one of my reporters said, better wear an overcoat, Levi. I said, you're kidding. And I was so happy I had my gloves.
You tried to lend me your gloves, I remember.
Yeah,
I appreciate
yeah.
that. But I said I'm from Bay Mills. I can't put on gloves until it's like
I'm not from
sealed.
Bellevue in Grand Rapids. No. But seriously, you've seen some of the intensity when I was picking these photos out recently. I was looking at some of the intensity on his face, and one thing that I'm going back to Deb Holland. I get a little mushy talking about her because I just have tremendous respect for her. Every single stop had a box of tissues. And Deb Holland, the Secretary of the Interior, as she listened to the elders and the descendants of those who went to Indian boarding school, survivors, and many of them came with tears. I'm talking decades later, just tears, telling stories of being raped and physically abused, tongues cut because they spoke their native language. Deb Holland had tissues and she used them. And up in Anchorage, she got up and took it to this third row because somebody was crying. And here's the Secretary of the Interior giving out tissues. And so I don't want people people ever forget what happened to Indian boarding schools. Just as Jewish people say, lest we forget. They never want to what happened in the Holocaust. And we know in this country today, people want to deny. They don't want us to make people feel guilty. And I'm not so sure it's about making people feel guilty, but we should always remember what happened. I know when I went to Genoa, where my grandmother went, that had a profound day. It took me, I got home about 2 o'clock in the morning that Sunday morning. My mother was still alive. I went over and we cried together. I said, it was so significant to me. And Bryan, you probably went to, you went to more places than I did in terms of, because I went to the hearings and the listening sessions, but you actually went to a lot of boarding schools. I know I didn't get to go to, because you made reference of it. And I say this to Americans, and one of the last things that President Biden did was declare the Carlisle Indian School National Memorial to Indian Boarding Schools? Monument. And like I say, every city, and maybe not every last town, but certainly in the state of Michigan, we had, I think, 4, 5, 6, depending on how you count them, boarding schools. But we really do. And I would love someplace in downtown Grand Rapids, people walk up and say, what's this about? And then they read the people of this land. This is what happened to their kids. And I just, I'm kind of on a mission. I want to make that happen. I want to make that happen in this town. This is my town. And I love this town. I grew up here. So we have got to happen. We might have to raise the money, Mr. Museum Director, but let's go do it. Bryan, what gives you hope before we turn it over to the audience?
I think one of the things that gives me hope is Indian people have a superpower, and that's our ability to do generational work. And we can pick things up that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents carried, and carry it for our lifetime and put it down and let our kids and grandkids carry it, without knowing that we didn't start the work, knowing we might not finish it. And so that's built into almost every indigenous culture here in the Americas, some version of that, and that gives me hope. Because we don't operate on a 2-year election cycle. We don't operate on a 4-year election cycle. We don't operate on a decade cycle. This is generational stuff. And like Vine Deloria said in that essay, and you look back on the res in our communities, life goes on. It's going to be hard some years. It's going to be really hard. But what gives me hope is our capacity, our willingness as Indian people to do generational work. And that's never changed, and I don't see it changing now.
Let's give Bryan Newland a big hand. Lynn, you want to do the
So do we have any questions from the
I just wanted to
audience?
like move a minute. I saw Deb Howland interviewed after the election was over, and she was really light, and she did say that you guys put a lot of things in place that we wouldn't see until the future. But now that the election's over, can you tell me what they are?
Sure.
Like, what good things?
Sure. One of the things that we did was change federal regulations to make it easier for tribes to put land into trust, to get their land back.
Good.
And that's something that hadn't ever been done by the federal government. The federal government had only ever been in the business of taking land from Indians,
Right.
and then making it hard for Indians to get land back. And that's something that we did. And that's something I will say, that directive came from President Biden, his commitment. And so that's not going to be undone. We invested $40-some billion in Indian country in 4 years.
I know that she also approved electricity to all of the reservations. It'll
Yeah.
take time to get there, but yeah.
And that's money that once it's spent, it's hard to claw back in and take that. And in a lot of those communities, that's drinking water, that's electricity, things that a lot of people take for granted. The other thing is, I think this work on boarding schools, we've seen it cross over into public consciousness and public awareness now.
Yes.
And I've had people even up in my hometown. Brimley Bay Mills is a small tribe, small reservation, and the town of Brimley is right next door. And people I grew up with, right next door to the res, tell me, I had no idea about these boarding schools. And I've seen that replicated over and over around the country. And one of the things that I saw that was a benefit of that work is that actually the response was not partisan. There were Republicans in Congress who supported funding to do that work. And so I don't think that toothpaste is going back in the tube.
No.
The work might, die down a little bit here for a couple of years, but
Well, it's
Indian
not-
country and
it's
local
two
communities.
countries it's been hit with, so, yeah.
The Indian country and universities and states and local institutions and religious institutions, that work's continuing. And so those are some examples of things that are going to continue.
She knows all your good work, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sweet. I got two questions for you. One kind of came up as you were talking. I'll go with that one first since it's a little sadder. How do you, you were talking about how we as natives kind of carry things with us and stuff, and you mentioned the positive side of that. How do we as youth kind of navigate the damaging side of that, where we often kind of carry our past traumas from our family and what we've been through till now, and how do we continue forward with that?
I don't have, all the answers to that. What I can say is being aware of it, being self-aware of how it affects you in your daily life, and trying to address it is important. I really struggled with this boarding school work. Especially after these hearings, I found myself getting really physically worn down, getting short with my family. I'm kind of a grump anyway sometimes, but I was really feeling emotions and things that I hadn't ever really confronted myself. And so one of the things that I did was I reached out to one of our spiritual traditional healers back in Bay Mills, but I also got myself a therapist to help me process this stuff. And I'm a work in progress. And so to answer your question, how do we confront that? I think we can only do, what we're capable of, and we've got to be aware of how it affects us and try to address it. And, I'm not going to trauma dump on you or the audience. I want to also share the importance of getting help. That was, throughout this time, some of my friends and my wife, saw me really struggling with this, and they were saying, Bryan, you don't have to have all the answers, get some help. And so I did, and it's been helpful. And so these are some of the ways I'm trying to work on myself to break this cycle. I don't have all the answers. The fact that you're asking this question and that you have that consciousness and the self-awareness to understand your role in the intergenerational trauma, you're many steps ahead of probably where your ancestors were. And so kudos to you.
Good. My second question is a little lighter. I would say, what would you say is the most beneficial for Native youth to get involved in, being prepared for a leader? What would you say we could get involved in, be a part of? What would you have us be doing now so we can take the next step to do better for our future?
I think so. A lot of things. One is to make sure life goes on. Not get too wrapped up into the spectacle of politics. One of the things I think for Indian people is that we have to, every generation has a responsibility for, is maintaining their cultural autonomy. If we don't exist as Indian people, there's no reason for us to exist as Indian people, right? And so there are a lot of things that each of us can do to do that. Whether that's learning your language, getting teachings, or just being a present in your community doing Indian stuff. Maybe making maple syrup, snow snake in the wintertime. You don't have to be, if you're Anishinaabe, you don't have to be Meday Society, but we have to maintain our cultural lifeways and our way of being and our cultural autonomy. Otherwise, there's no reason for us to continue to exist as Indian people. And so I would encourage you and others to do those things. I was raised Catholic, and my parents were really good parents. They did the best they could, and that's how they chose to raise me. And as I've gone on in my life, tried to come back and get knowledge and teachings that I never got when I was a kid. And it can be really scary, because I can just speak for myself. I feel like, I'm Indian, I should know this stuff, right? And then you feel embarrassed for asking, or here I am in a language class at Bay Mills Community College, and my classmate is a teenager, and I'm a young elder, middle-aged. So I'm going on. I think these are some of the ways that you can get engaged and get involved, is to carry on that responsibility for cultural autonomy.
Jimmy Butcher.
I wanted to ask, sorry if you came in a few minutes late, so you might have already talked about it, but I wanted to ask about your experience at the Michigan Law Program, and what were some of the challenges that you faced as an Indigenous person in law school, and how many years was it after you graduated law school that you went and worked at the White House?
Thank you. It was Michigan State Law School.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I always got to take my digs at Michigan. I think, I'm guessing many people in this room have experience being the representative of your gender, your race, your culture. So there weren't a lot of natives at MSU Law when I was going there. There were some of us. So there's always you're the Indian, and that's a challenge. And I think that's just, one of the things I saw Deb Holland do was just be unabashedly Indigenous. I'm just going to be, I'm a cabinet secretary, but I'm going to be an Indian. I'm going to be a Native cabinet secretary. And so watching her was really inspiring, wearing ribbon skirts to the State of the Union and things like that. I was trying to skate by without, drawing a lot of attention when I was in law school. So that was a challenge. And I was a new dad, so I was going to class and just coming home, trying to do my best there. And what was the second part of your question?
How long was it after you graduated law school when you went to go work for the White House?
2 years. But again, I don't know if you were in for this story, but that was being in the right place at the right time and being lucky. Probably more than it was being good. And you gotta put yourself in a position to have a lucky break. But success, I hate when I see these guys get on, and it's always guys, get on TV. It's like, oh, I'm really successful because I'm brilliant and I'm great and I'm just the best at everything. Like, there's so much luck involved in getting, into whatever you would describe as success. So I happen to be lucky because I, kind of fumbled my way into, meeting the right people at the right time in my life. But you can do things to give yourself more chances to be lucky. But that's what it was for me.
Junior Gooch.
Hi, I'm aware that boarding schools cause many Native people to not fully trust the education system, especially due to them prioritizing manual labor and assimilation. So going forward, do you think people in positions of power could start to indigenize school curriculums and incorporate two-eyed seeing and land-based learning to bridge that gap and to improve that trust?
Yes.
Okay. And following that, I was wondering, what are some examples, like main examples of indigenizing school curriculums that you would suggest for some of us that actually like work in school classrooms and stuff like that?
Well, one is to be native wherever you're at. If you're working in the classroom, sometimes there's a temptation to think like, oh, things never get better. We always have these problems. When my sister and I were kids in our school, half native. In our school, they used to not intentionally not teach about Native history in our school, and half the kids were Native. I remember one time, this was now way back in the 1900s. I remember one time in high school, the school was observing National Prayer Day, basically giving people time to step out of the building to go pray. And I'll never forget the principal of the high school. He had this big booming voice coming out into the hallway as people were walking outside. And he said, "This is a reminder, if anybody is caught with tobacco and you're under the age of 18, we will call the Michigan State Police and you will be cited for being a minor in possession." Knowing that the Indian kids who were going out to pray were going to go out with tobacco. Right? And now at our school, they've got Ojibwe language, they got a school powwow, they got Native teachers, they got Native studies. So these things do get better in a short time, but that's because people like you don't take no for an answer. And so the best way to do that, I think, is to just be who you are in that space and be unyielding in doing what needs to be done.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, question for you. I wanted to know, what do you think President Trump is going to do in terms of, fulfilling the trust responsibility? So there's a bunch of levels underneath that. I work for my tribe's wholly owned non-gaming tribal business enterprise, and a lot of our growth over the next 5-10 years it was in our strategic plan, is supposed to be federal contracting. So, and Levi, I'm one of those readers that one of your readers that went up when President Trump got elected, because I'm scared of what's going to happen with that, and a lot of the people in my company are scared, and they've asked us to take pronouns out of our signatures, and because of all of the work that we are doing with the federal government, they're scared of using language like preference and DEI and a preference in federal contracting and sole sourcing, all of those things. So what do you think is going to happen with all of that?
Yeah. So in response to that too, I just gave the stiffen your spine and be Indian everywhere. And I think that's true, but also, I have my mom's voice ringing in my ears about pick your battles wisely. And there's battles that are worth fighting and battles that aren't. And our job sometimes is to survive. So I think in response to your question, ways that tribes and tribal businesses can be successful is to be part of coalitions that, frankly, the Trump administration, Republicans listen to. And speak their language on that, business, economic development, money, banks, finance, I'm trying to think what are all the other words. And to be a part of those coalitions because there's strength in numbers. And that's something, again, Indian people have been doing for a long time. I'm under no illusions that they're going to support 8A contracting or be like big advocates for that. So we're going to have that Article 1, that congressional strategy, and get what we need through Congress, and have our members of Congress on the hook for advocating to the administration on those things. And looking for opportunities, to engage with the federal government where our interests align with their interests. I have found in my experience, working in Indian country, that a lot of times Republican elected officials are willing to be transactional with Indian tribes and Indian-owned businesses if it advances their interests and their agenda. So being strategic about those engagements, but it requires planning and a lot of discretion about what battles we're willing to pick and which ones we're not.
Ani, my question came to mind when you were talking about Deloria. And Custer died for your sins. He spends a lot of time talking about the BIA and just the federal government as an extension or continuation of colonialism. And I was wondering what your feelings and thoughts were as somebody who obviously represented the federal government in some capacity. And did you ever feel like you brushed up against that legacy, excluding the boarding schools, because I think that's a very obvious example. And then do you think that America's institutions are capable of renewal in a way that we really don't talk about a lot?
Man, I love that question. We've got limited time, so I'll do my best to be concise. Yes, I learned the hard way the first time I was at the Department of the Interior in my 20s. I remember this meeting. It was Assistant Secretary Echo Hawk and me, and there was a tribal leader and his attorney at the table, so just 4 of us in the room. And Larry Echo Hawk is a very patient, quiet, soft-spoken man, and this tribal leader was just giving him the business, man. Just like sitting for me to lean away, but raised voice, and you got to do this, and you're failing to do this. And so I'm in my late 20s, and I'm the assistant secretary. I'm his advisor, so like it's one of my jobs is to protect him. And I'm just I'm getting all riled up. You're not going to talk to my boss. And he kept just gently kind of putting his hand on my wrist when he was out of the corner of his eye, seeing me get agitated. And after the meeting, we were going back to his office, and he said, Bryan, he's not mad at me. He's representing his tribe, and he's speaking to the federal government. And and then he gave me this long talk about how we step into the shoes of that. And that was really eye-opening for me, and that's something I took back. Actually, when I was tribal court judge, I tried to take people when they're upset in the courtroom. That's a really stressful time for them. They're mad. They don't want to be there. And I took that back when I was in my last role as assistant secretary. I'm a federal official. Nobody owes me deference just because I'm Native. I'm here for the federal government. And so you got to kind of just wear that. What they say, if the shoe fits, you got to wear it. And do the best you can while you're wearing it. And so that was a challenge. And I tried to pass Larry Echo Hawk's lesson on to our team to make sure they understood that. Related to that with the boarding school work, I was talking about how hard it was because almost everyone on our team who was doing that work was Native. And one of my colleagues said something one day. He said, when I was really upset, and he said, it's not fair that Indian people have to be the ones sitting in these rooms, taking other people's trauma, taking the beatings on this stuff and carrying this around. He said, it's not fair that it has to be Indian people. He said, but it was always going to take Indian people. And, I carried that lesson around with me too, because it was very wise. And so, yeah, you got to step into those shoes, and you wear them, and you walk in them, and you got to change them faster than they change you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Question about that.
Question, Gary Marsaw by Shin Polgated Band. One of the things I noticed that what we're running into right now is that a lot of our money we get reimbursed for from the government. We're not spending any money right. We're about $60 million that we have just sitting there, but we have to spend that first, and we don't know if we're going to get that back. That's devastating to a child. I mean, we have money and resources to replace it if we have to, but not if this gets tied up in court. So kind of what is your feelings on that? It's kind of a two-part question I have, because we work in 2 states. We work in Indiana and Michigan, and under Governor Holcomb's administration, we were able to get our compact signed, ICWA recognized in the state courts, and our law enforcement recognized as official law enforcement. But how do you feel about like the reimbursements and stuff?
That's really tough, because I mean you are doing that calculus just like a lot of other tribal officials and frankly state government officials across the country right now. I think these funds are part of the trust responsibility to Indian country, and it's not President Trump's money.
Yeah.
And it's not President Trump's promise or not, it's the United States promise. And so if the United States says, okay, Ben, we're gonna award you $10 million to do this program for your people, that doesn't matter who the president is. Congress has appropriated that money, and I think we've got to be steadfast but strategic about carrying out that work and holding the federal government to its word. Because the last I checked this morning anyway, we still have courts that also have judicial independence to hold the government to its word.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's just very troubling times in trying to explain it to staff, and the money that we can draw down, we have been drawing down at every chance we get. But the other money, until you spend it, you can't do that. And it's an end of the year thing, and so yeah, as you know, a lot of us are nervous about that.
Yeah, and I think some of these things, I think people are going to look at and say, hey, this one might not be worth the trouble. And then, some tribes have gotten $10, $15, $20 million awards or contracts to do things, and have laid out money already. I think in those cases, that's gonna be worth the trouble.
Yeah. One last thing on that. Like a lot of the green initiative grants and stuff that are out there are like our compliance department stuff who applies for grants. When it comes time to go to that page, the link is missing to apply, and yes, it's just scary times that this is going on.
One of the ways to prove to people that government doesn't work is to make government not work. To cut staff, close offices, make the web page inoperable, all these things. I've seen just in the last 60 days tribes having success working with Republican members of Congress to advocate to the executive branch, and I think that's going to have to be part of the strategy going forward on things like that. Because members of Congress love having money come back to their district.
Yeah.
We want the time to be transactional, which is antithesis to how we are.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Carol Keones, and I've been involved in this community for 60 years. And one of the things that my first husband and I did is we started a program called Owl Indian Outreach. It was a substance abuse program for Native Americans in this area. But we not only treated the Native Americans, we treated the street people because nobody wanted to deal with them. And I was also involved in going into the schools when we first got our Title IV, to going into the schools and finding our Indian children. Because they'd always been categorized as white. And we were seeking them out. And so we went into the schools and we found our Indian children to show Grand Rapids that yes, we do have a Native American population here. And yes, they're not being treated. There's no services for them being offered, and we fought for those services. I was on the committee for helping get Michigan Indian Child Welfare. I was on that committee so that our Indian children could be placed within our Indian families. And I am very proud of the work that I did. For 20 years, I was on the election board for my tribe. And it just warms my heart when I see our youth now wanting to pick that up and carry those things on. Because for a while there was a gap. Nobody was picking up the things. The youth, had been told in the school, you can't do that because you're an Indian. There's no program for you. So we created our programs here, and they're still going on. And we helped set up, my ex-husband was also on the Governor's Commission for Substance Abuse. He was the first Native American appointed to that commission. And I used to go to commission meetings with him. And one time I was there sitting outside the room, of course, there were some senators there that were talking about what they were going to do, some state senators what they were going to do about funding, because they were talking about funding. And they said, well, with the Indians, all we have to do is give them a bottle and put them in a corner, and they'll fight among themselves, and then we don't have to do anything. And I turned around and I looked at them, and I said, you know what? I said, I'm sorry, but I said, I am a proud Native American woman. And I find that very disgraceful, what you just said. And they were just taken aback. But I'm glad that I was able to have the opportunity to work on all the things that I did within the government here and in and one of the things that we had as a model for our substance abuse program is we taught the people we don't want you to want society, we want society to want you. And we gave them the tools to be able to do that. We worked with a lot of employers, we worked with a court system, so that when our Native Americans were going into the court system, they could contact us and we could help them get resources. We didn't only deal with substance abuse, we dealt with everything, working and everything. I worked for a lot of years with Levi, and we got a lot of things done. And I'm very proud of the things that have happened in this community, but there's still a lot to be done.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Is that my role?
I just wanted to talk to Mike once.
Did I ask a question, Kaya?
I don't have to.
Well, thank you all for coming out.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you for
everyone.
coming.
And Bryan, thank you very much for coming to Grand Valley State University. I'm going to ask you for a prediction. If Michigan and Michigan State played together,
Michigan State.
NCAA, who will win?
They
won't. Michigan's gonna lose. Go green.
Michigan.
Go white.
Go home. I was taught that the calendar says January, February is up. So, that's my prediction.
I like that.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Miigwech for tuning in. This episode was brought to you by Grand Valley State University and Native News Online. If you appreciate our warrior journalism, please consider donating